our foreign policy is often the result of whoever's in power rather than on fixed strategic issues. So as of now, it's too soon for us to tell which way AKD would go in terms of alignment. The official position right now is non-alignment.
Welcome to the Gist on Stat News Global. I'm Ramananda Sengupta. Today we are going to be discussing the presidential elections in Sri Lanka, which concluded yesterday. And our very special guest today is Mr. Nilanthan Niruthan, who is the executive editor of the Center for Law and Security Studies and a geopolitical analyst. He frequently writes for international publications on diverse issues like global security, international law, and geopolitical trends. He's also a lecturer at the National Defence College, the highest institution for military education in Sri Lanka. Thank you so much for joining us. I really appreciate your taking time out.
Thank you for having me. I'm a big fan and I'm looking forward to this conversation.
That makes two of us already. So let's start, right from the top. Were you personally expecting Mr. Dissanayake to be elected? Or was he just a dark horse who came in as an anti-incumbency thing?
You could say that there was a sense that he had the momentum, especially the last week or so. There was a certain visible momentum that you could see. But once again, as we all know, psephology is more of an art than a science. And these answers can never really be definitive, no matter how much time and energy we invest into predicting the result. So there was certainly some kind of visible momentum during the last few weeks. But the other candidates put up a pretty strong performance as well, especially Mr. Premadasa did slightly better than what his opponents thought he would do. However, AKD was the one to finish that golden mark, so to speak.
So it's okay if we keep calling him AKD, right? Because it saves us a lot of time and thing. I know my name is difficult to pronounce anyway, so so people call me.
I would certainly hope so. When you're an international statesman, your name has to be easier to pronounce as well. So AKD sounds a lot better.
I'm not a statesman, but yeah. So let's start what we can expect from him in terms of foreign policy in general from Sri Lanka. What kind of changes should we expect?
So the reality is that his foreign policy right now on paper is much more of a non-alignment policy, much like the standard Sri Lankan foreign policy over the last several decades has been, where the reality is that our foreign policy is often the result of whoever's in power rather than on fixed strategic issues. So as of now, it's too soon for us to tell which way AKD would go in terms of alignment. The official position right now is non-alignment, but I'm sure as we can discuss in this conversation, there are questions over whether that can even be practical in today's day and age. Can a country like Sri Lanka actually thrive by being non-aligned in a multilateral world? That is an open question as well.
So, I suspect that people in India too had some inkling that there was a possibility of him coming into power, because I think he came here in February to New Delhi, where he met Mr. Jaishankar and Mr. Towell, and then I think he went to the Amul milk factory here in Gujarat. Because he had some issues with Amul, but I think those were resolved once he saw the factory there. But overall, the JVP is known to be slightly more socialist, leftist kind of a outfit. Doesn't that impact foreign policy per se?
The thing is, it would if there was an organic growth. But we've got to remember that they got 3% of the vote in the last election. And they are the winners now. They got barely 4.5 lakhs as votes in the last election. And they got 45 lakhs or so this time. So this is not a mandate to turn Sri Lanka into a Marxist country as per the JVP's vision or anything like that. This was simply a mandate to deviate from and rectify many of the mistakes that were made in the past. And it was an expression of great anger and dissatisfaction for what's happened in the past. And also a call for hope, a call for a new kind of politics. In a way, it's interesting because you could almost see parallels of the Trump election and even the BJP's rise to national power in India, where it's almost seen as a symbol, as a fight against dynastic politics, as a draining of the swamp, as a beacon, electing a beacon who can hold the people accountable for the plunder of the past. So it's the mandate given to the JVP is because of these factors rather than
Hmm.
because of Marxist origin. And if the
Okay.
question is, okay, will he now take us in China's direction simply because he is a Marxist or simply because they're a Marxist
Hmm.
party? I would say that's very unlikely when we look at the situation here. If anything, AKD has been extremely critical of the way in which China has dealt with Sri Lanka, whether it's the way in which national strategic assets like the Hambantota port were essentially given away for almost a century, or the way in which we borrowed large sums, unsustainable sums of money to the point where we found ourselves in a debt trap. He has been highly critical of all of that. And we've got to remember that these are essentially China's two main tools to
Right.
entrench themselves in Sri Lanka.
Hmm.
So, under AKD presidency, neither of these tools are likely to work. So, maybe he will have a protectionist foreign policy where he does not want foreign powers involved here too much. But the net winner of that
Hmm.
strategic calculus will still be
Right.
Bharat and not China, because China loses out a lot more because of that protectionism than
Hmm.
New Delhi.
Right. But before I come to that, which side is going to lean on, he's also made several noises about renegotiating with the IMF and things like that. Is that actually possible? Because once I believe you agree to the terms, is it how difficult is it to again start renegotiating those things?
So it's going to be very difficult, but at the same time, he couldn't have really run an election campaign without making that promise. I mean, let's be practical here. These are political parties during electoral campaigns and all that. So there are certain narratives because, look, it is true that people at the bottom rungs of Sri Lankan society are feeling the brunt of the austerity measures that the IMF requires us to do and things
Right.
like that. So there's no way he could have been quiet on that matter. The issue
Hmm.
of whether that can actually be converted into real time results is a completely different question. There is a hope amongst certain members of the newly elected party that it will be possible, but there will be many, many obstacles in their way, internal and external. Even the internal bureaucratic challenges will be very difficult for them to now go back on some of these things.
I would have thought so because once you sort of lock in with the IMF, very difficult to sort of start renegotiating it. But this is slightly sort of how would I say a tricky question, I suppose. But you know, does a politician sort of leaning towards either China or India uh, was that a factor in these elections?
Not in these elections. No, these elections were fought predominantly on different issues. So I would say number one was the economy, but more importantly, it was an expression of a lot of both anger and hope that we saw materialize 2 years ago when there was the big Araglia protest to oust the then president and all that. So, in a sense,
That's right.
that anger and that hope for a better future, it's a synergy of both hope and anger that is still present, and this is in many ways an expression of that.
Uh-huh. We keep talking about China and Sri Lanka and how China and India and how Sri Lanka has a tough time trying to juggle the two. Um, but I suspect the other player that's increasingly getting involved here is the United States. Do you think that also is a I mean is the United States a factor in how the political situation in Sri Lanka?
So, yeah, this is a tricky question. So, let me say this, right? So, when we had the previous president here, when
Hmm.
we had Mr. Ranil Wickremesinghe here, you
Right.
essentially had three countries in South Asia, in Pakistan, in Bangladesh, and in Sri Lanka, who did
Hmm.
not have an elected government, as in a government where you could argue that there were certain doubts about whether they could win a proper election or not. And
Right.
coincidentally, all three happen to be very close to the United States, more so than other countries. So I'm not here
Hmm.
to push conspiracy theories, but that is a
Hmm.
pattern that we have to
Right.
notice. And it's certainly true that if you want engagement with the IMF and with the international community and all that, you will have to make
Hmm.
gestures of friendship towards Washington. And that's precisely what happened over the last 2 years. I mean, when we engage with the West is when we can also have a certain level of interaction with these international institutions, right? So, yes, I think it's given that the Americans will try to at least have some kind of presence here. But in the
Hmm.
overall Quad dynamic, I don't think this will be a thorn per se in anybody's side other than China's.
Hmm. You know, the other thing that is interesting here is that when um, the economic crisis happened, and India did try to sort of help in many ways, to, financially and other aid wise and everything like that. Um, Before that, I think a lot of people were thinking that China. This is, of course, the feeling that I get from talking to people here. I don't know what the thing is on the ground there. The China is actually, helping Sri Lanka develop economically and things like that. I am not sure how many people really know how Hambantota became Chinese territory all of a sudden for like 9 years, because that is something most people would have a problem with, that you're, but under the circumstances, not much that you could do. Um, has that sort of helped get some kind of a pro-India kind of a feeling in Sri Lanka?
So there is a pro-India feeling in the sense that there is an acknowledgement that India was the major actor that intervened to save Sri Lanka from a big disaster. Right? There's
Hmm.
absolutely no doubt that there's some kind of awareness of that amongst the people who follow current events and who follow the news. But
Right.
once again, as with any developing nation that's also a parliamentary democracy, many of these decisions are not made based on that. Some people just hate China for the sake of it. Some people just hate India for the sake of it. You will also get
Absolutely.
people like that, especially when we're a small country who has to live almost in a state of paranoia over
Hmm.
what machinations other nations might have for us. So that's there. But I would certainly say that in terms of PR, there's been a big boost. And more importantly, uh, if we were to analyze the difference between how the Indian media and the Indian population covered that crisis, and if we compare that with how the Chinese media compared it, I think it becomes quite clear where the line between friends and business partners are drawn. In
Hmm.
China, this was covered very clinically. It's not like they were happy or gleeful or anything like that, but it was
Right.
covered very clinically with proper reportage as just another crisis around the world. Whereas in
Hmm.
India, you could clearly see an outbreak of sympathy, an outbreak of compassion, once again, because of the civilizational and cultural ties between the two
Hmm.
countries. So that was very visibly noticeable as well.
Hmm.
And this is why, once again, I just wanted to emphasize what I had said previously as well, that this whole idea of AKD now going pro China and all that, I think India has to feel kind of insulted by that narrative, or India has to feel that this is very lazy analysis, because what that narrative tries to push is that Indian foreign policy here has been a failure. That S. Jaishankar's foreign policy here 2 years
Right.
ago was a failure, and now look, they have a Marxist president who's now going to take the country towards New Delhi. That's not the case at all. The way that India
Uh,
handled it 2 years ago essentially prevented China from ever, at least for the next 20 to 25 years, from going back to the prominence that it had a decade ago.
Hmm. I don't think that narrative is really going on very strong here, simply because when AKD was here, he, I think, informally said that he won't let Sri Lankan airspace or land be used for any anti-India kind of activity at all. I mean, he may have just said it like that, but I think people here believed him because I mean, you believe what you want to believe. But other than India, other than uh, China, let's talk about Pakistan. I mean, Pakistan has also a very good relationship with Sri
Yes.
Lanka. Will that change?
I don't think that will change because of any cultural enmity. I think the
Hmm.
only reason that will change is because the two no longer really have that much to offer each other than other than a strategic alliance. I mean, economically, both economies are facing serious challenges. Culturally and societally, both countries are looking at very serious challenges in terms of austerity and political stability and things like that. So
Hmm.
the lack of any real major initiatives between the two nations is purely because, or will purely be because of a lack of capacity rather than any kind of cultural hostility or diplomatic hostility.
Hmm. That's interesting. The other thing that I've always wondered, and this is something that perhaps you, as a geopolitical analyst, will be able to explain much better than the politicians will. But my understanding is that India is unwilling to sell offensive weapons to its neighbors, and when these neighbors go and try to get them from somewhere else, India gets uppity, saying, how come you're buying it from Pakistan or China or wherever it is? Is that an issue with Sri Lanka as well?
So I wouldn't say that it's a major issue with Sri Lanka because once again, in the security calculus, most of Sri Lanka's military procurements and things like that are geared towards internal security. So
Hmm.
our entire security forces, what we plan for, is essentially geared around the internal security of our territorial waters and our territorial borders and things like
Right.
that. But once, I mean, these are the major problems that any region will run into when there's no real defense alliance treaty. This is the problem when it's all done on an oral friendship basis, because then it becomes hostage to local politics. If there's a
Of
pro
course.
India president here, that changes the equation. If there's a pro China president here, that changes it. So I think these are also the inevitabilities of not having a proper defense framework or alliance framework in the region.
But I remember I used to go to the Officers Training Academy in Chennai quite often when I used to work there, and I remember a lot of Sri Lankans used to train there as well. Um, do Sri Lankans also have similar sort of training, let's say, happening out of Pakistan or China?
Yes, so there's the defense college, for example, where there are exchange students who are military officers who come from
Hmm.
Pakistan, Bangladesh, Kenya, Saudi Arabia. So many of the military academies here, the National Defense College, the Staff College, the Army War College, they have international students coming in as well, and we send out our officers to many of these nations as well. So on a small person to person level, these things do happen. And I believe that there's even a contingent in Malaysia or Indonesia or something right now of Sri
Hmm.
Lankan soldiers. So this does
Hmm.
happen, but once again, not the way that it could or would if we talk about a proper infrastructure that's laid
Right.
out legally for something like this.
Hmm. Now, the other thing that I think India would expect in many ways, it's been lobbying for that for a long time, is to give some kind of, thing to the Chinese, to the, sorry, not Chinese, to the Tamils. But this time I also heard something very interesting, that apparently the minorities who traditionally were very anti JVP have actually voted for him. I mean, I don't know how far that's true, but I read somewhere that a certain percentage did vote for him.
Yeah. So
Does that mean?
The JVP is still certainly lagging behind in the Tamil areas. But
Mhm.
however, it is true that they have been able to make some kind of penetration into the minority communities, whether this is Tamil or Muslim. It is true
Right.
that a lot of people, I mean, and once again, it has to be true, right? Because for a party to jump from 4.5 lakhs
Yeah,
to 45 lakhs in a single
absolutely.
election, there has to be a penetration from many, many other markets as well, obviously. So
Hmm.
I'm Tamil myself. And when I speak to many, many different people here from different walks of life and all that, I certainly do feel that the JVP has made inroads. Not large enough inroads for them to actually count that as a vote bank, but certainly much bigger inroads than you would have expected them to 5 years ago.
Which is I mean, a very positive thing, because I mean, I don't think one would have expected that, really, given that earlier they did have a very sort of a strident, you know, anti-minority kind of a thing. Although I don't think that was really a Sinhala kind of a thing. It was something else. I mean,
Yeah, because the JVP itself was has had numerous civil wars with the Sri Lankan government, where insurrections have had to be crushed with very harsh measures and very brutal methods to crush those insurgencies. So in terms of the JVP and the Tamil community, there is a lot of suspicion, mutual suspicion even, but it's not the same as the actual LTT versus the Sri Lankan government type dynamic.
right. Hmm. Hmm. And as a analyst yourself, who's been sort of studying India and Sri Lanka's sort of place in the world, um, you've seen what India has tried to do. But in geopolitics, there's no such thing, I think, as a free lunch. Obviously, there is something that India also expects in return. I don't know what exactly the expectations are, because different people will tell you different things. Um, there was also talk about some wind farm that I think the Adanis were trying to build in which I think AKD had some issues with. But I believe internally people are saying that what, that is actually going to give us clean energy and we need it. So let's not mess with it. Is that the correct assessment?
Yeah, so AKD's major problem is that it's got very unfair terms. The Adani Green wind energy investments here, his major thing
Hmm.
is that there are very unfair terms, and he has publicly stated that he will cancel that entire thing. But whether he would actually do it once he's in power or not, because of many of the factors that you mentioned, that remains to be seen. But
Hmm.
ultimately, connectivity has to be and will be the major rescue when it comes to the Sri Lankan economy. There's just no way around that. The only way for Sri Lanka to really go back to being a booming economy like it once was, where there was a lot of per capita income compared to the rest of the region like it once was, connectivity is the only way forward. There will obviously be many suspicions, a lot of paranoia, a lot of misunderstandings, and all that. But all of that needs to be navigated through. And this is the one thing that I hope even AKD understands. I think he does, that
Hmm.
connectivity now with India is the only way forward. He has a tourism target, for example, of 4 million tourists a year, and he's been publicly promising that. Last year we had about 1.5 million tourists, so he wants to almost triple that. India
Hmm.
is our closest neighbor. India is the most populous country in the world. And India is also already the largest supplier of tourists to Sri Lanka. So there's no
Right.
way that this number can jump from 1.5 to 4 in the near future without a lot of connectivity synergy with India. So that has to be the future. In terms of the investments, those things that you laid out, once again, our energy security is a major factor here, even with the common voter. That mindset has changed. The common voter does understand the need for energy security. I mean, the common voter has to understand that we had 13-hour power cuts at one point when we
Right.
had the crisis.
Hmm.
So India now investing in alternative energy is a good sign. There might be individual hiccups like this, but this is the future. There's no doubt about it.
Hmm. But other than dealing with China and India and across various issues, including connectivity, are there any other specific challenges that you think AKT might face? Is there something that he might have a problem dealing with?
I don't think in terms of foreign policy and geopolitics he will have big problems per se, as long as he doesn't try to rock the boat too much. Internally,
Hmm.
there's talk of there being a lot of infighting within the ruling coalition, the NPP, and obviously it's always going to be difficult when it's very easy to be in opposition and find out when you actually wear the crown and sit on the throne that it's a completely
True.
different universe from what you imagine, right? So those will be his primary problems. But as long as he's able to keep this strategic calculus in mind of
Hmm.
connectivity, alternative energy, bringing in tourists, and that he has to play ball with other nations, particularly with the closer neighbors, I think foreign
Right.
policy is sorted as long as he has that understanding.
That's good to hear because one of the things that I suppose would be a big challenge is that when you spoke about, let's say, Adani, that even Adani faces issues in other countries too because of corruption and things like that, and you have the same thing with the Chinese as well. And obviously, anybody who wants to deal with them will want to say that, look, why should we pay you or have to bribe somebody to get your thing? We want to make it fair and above board. Well, is there a feeling that India too is as corrupt or thing as China could have been, or not. I won't use the words corrupt, but um, let's just say the politicians from both sides like to take their cut from
Yes,
those
I
things.
mean,
So,
because the people here know that that's what our politicians do. So
mhm,
they know that this is the way that most political parties around the world work. So just as how we have corrupt politicians who want to cut for everything, they do understand
mhm,
that in other parts of the world too, this is what will happen. Incidentally, they might not know as much about corruption in China because it's a different kind of corruption, and
right.
it's the kind of corruption that can be spun in other ways as well. Whereas corruption in India is very similar to the type of political corruption that you see in Sri Lanka with the dynastic politics and favorable people favorable to the party getting the valuable posts and stuff like that. So that's a bit more visible here.
Hmm. And I mean, yeah, I'm glad you brought that up because one of the things that would be sort of in India's favor is the fact that Chinese culture and Chinese sort of the whole thing of Chinese philosophy of how they operate is not really. I mean, I guess even we in India don't understand it, and we have them right on our border. So for Sri Lanka, but are there a lot of given the sort of Chinese projects at play? Has that changed? Do you have Confucius centers and things like that?
I mean, there is a Confucius Center, but other than holding a few events here or there, they are not that active. The level of Chinese engagement here has certainly decreased a lot. We must say that
Okay.
the kind of engagement that we see has decreased a lot, particularly after the 2022 crisis. These are because
Hmm.
of two major reasons. The first is that, as I pointed out earlier, even if Sri Lanka goes into a very protectionist and isolationist phase in its foreign policy, because of the
Hmm.
civilizational ties, India will always be involved in some way. Either
Right.
the flow of goods and services, the flow of people, the flow of movies and ideas and saris and food and all that. India will always be involved in Sri Lanka in some way beyond politics and economics. Whereas Chinese involvement in Sri Lanka depends entirely on politics and economics. If China wants to go back to how prominent they were a decade ago, it can
Hmm.
only be with the blessings of the Sri Lankan government of the day.
Right.
Whereas India has the advantage of just being able to wait it out as well.
Hmm. So what I'm hearing is that we won't see road signs in Mandarin in Sri Lanka anytime soon because you're seeing them
Hi,
in Nepal.
go on, go on.
So I mean, so that's not going to happen anytime soon. It could happen, I suppose, but it's not going to happen anytime soon.
Highly unlikely, particularly considering the fact that everybody now wants to prop themselves up as an alternative to the Rajapaksa regimes of the past. So repeating those same mistakes and going back to that same mentality is political suicide. Even for AKD, the last thing he wants is to start doing things which are seen as a reversion of the Rajapaksa regimes. So they will not want to touch that pill for a while.
That's very interesting to hear. I think we're running out of time. So, but is there something specific that you feel that India could or should do to sort of reinforce its position if it needs to right now in Sri Lanka? Is there something that I'm not talking about a quick fix or something, but something that sort of brings out the fact that there is of course, like I said, there's no such thing as a free lunch in foreign policy, but that it is altruism in some ways. It is not always that I expect something in return. Is there something India can do to sort of buttress that image, or
There
should
is a
do?
way, yeah, there is something that India can do, but I'm not too sure whether this would give India short-term results. It's a long-term play, which is
Of
essentially
course.
to ensure that when it comes to some kind of deal, there's always parity, because the major problem that many Sri Lankans have is that any kind of interaction with India opens up the Sri Lankan market for Indian businesses, but that India does not want to open up its market for our businesses. So
I
if there's
know I
some
have
kind of
difficulty getting Dilma tea. I mean, I
exactly.
I love the tea that comes in from Nuvra and all that stuff. But I have to ask my friends to get it for me because they're not available here.
Exactly. And if some kind of parity can be reached, because this is where a lot of young Sri Lankans can actually start seeing the influence of India being a benevolent power in the region. The way that people were able to visibly see Chinese money to the point where they were willing to look the other side when concerns were raised, the
Hmm.
people here need to visibly see that result. There needs to be a generation of young people here who grow up doing business in that way, and into whose psyches it is etched that this framework and Indo-Sri Lanka relationship is what contributed to economic prosperity here.
And that's not really happening. Is that what you're saying?
It's not really happening. I mean, I have no idea why, but if you look at the basic, both the digital connectivity and the business connectivity and any kind of economic connectivity between the two countries in general, considering how close we are, it's shocking how badly connected the two countries are. It's absolutely shocking how badly connected India and Sri Lanka are. And I think this
Hmm.
is also because of foreign policy being held hostage to individual regimes. So
Of
any
course.
individual regime that brings it up will be accused of being an Indian stooge or something like that. And
Hmm.
non-alignment is kind of seen as the safe option. But when we look at even just general countries from around the world who have a basic level of proximity with each other, India and Sri Lanka are not even connected with each other on that level, unfortunately.
That's a shame. I hope the people who
Huge.
can fix this are listening to this when we air it. I, for one, will try and push it. But one of the things that I liked about AKD coming into play here is that forget all his politics, forget everything else. He's probably the youngest contender who won, right? He's among the other lot.
Yes.
And I think that makes a huge difference because younger people tend to bring in a lot of fresh thinking. The older generation comes with their own baggage and their own sort of pre-formatted way of looking at things. I get the feeling that he will probably look at things slightly differently, and that could be a very good thing for both Sri Lanka and India.
Yeah,
You
so
know,
it could certainly be a good thing as long as the old guard does not try to kneecap every move that he makes. And that really is the worry now. That so, for example, whenever you have a youth-led movement, there will obviously be transgressions here and there as well, because you're dealing with a very passionate and almost volatile vote bank. And you're
of
also
course.
looking at a lot of existing parties who have entrenched here, who've made money here in all kinds of ways. So
Hmm.
being a cannonball into the system is a good thing. and we need to hope that the building itself does not stop the cannonball's momentum, if that makes sense.
Makes sense. It makes a lot of sense. I mean, that's actually a very nice way of putting it. You know, so I'm afraid we're running out of time. So let's conclude on that thing. Is there anything specific that you have in mind that you feel that, apart from this connectivity thing, that you feel the Indian government needs to hear or know?
Just to be optimistic, just because I have been quite disheartened by the way that I've noticed many English language and even Tamil news channels have covered these elections, because I was watching and kind of observing both yesterday, and the stereotyping of him as just a Marxist, who as a disruptive Marxist
I
who's
know.
now going to take things into a pro-China direction and all that. I would urge far more optimism there. Look, maybe that's what happens. Maybe I turn out to be wrong, and this entire thing is a disaster. We never know in politics. But right now, we have no real reason for this doom and gloom pessimism about a Marxist taking over. To the contrary, I feel that there's a lot of reason for us to be optimistic that he will work with maybe not India, but Bharat, certainly, in that civilizational and cultural sense.
I mean, on that optimistic note, I think we can close this. Um, I really look forward to having you again with us some of these days. Very soon.
Anytime, my pleasure. I'm a huge fan, so thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. That was Mr. Nilanthan Niruthan, geopolitical analyst from Sri Lanka, talking to us about the implications of Mr. Dissanayake becoming President of Sri Lanka. I do hope you enjoyed this particular edition of The Gist, and I look forward to seeing you again. Till then, this is Ramananda Sengupta signing out.